In the autumn of 1887, in the high desert territory of southern Colorado, a young woman named Vera Collum paid $2 for a door. Not a house, not a plot of ground, a door. It stood alone at the edge of a salvage lot on the outskirts of Creed, propped against a fence post with a rusted hinge still attached, its frame gone, its paint long since surrendered to sun and wind. The lot occupied the gap between a livery and a collapsed warehouse on the south end of town, and on that particular Tuesday morning in October, it held a mixed cargo of the kind that silver towns accumulate in their early years: broken harness fittings, half a wagon tongue, 3 cast-iron stove lids of mismatched sizes, a roll of rusted wire, and the door. The auctioneer, a stout man named Giles who ran the lot out of a leather-bound ledger he kept under his arm, moved through the inventory at a brisk pace and offered the door last, almost as an afterthought, the way a man disposes of a thing he cannot catalog. He called it pine. He said it was fire-damaged on the interior face. He said it had come out of a property on Carson Street, and that the property's current occupants, whoever they were, had no interest in its return. Vera could see from 20 paces that it was not pine. She had been standing at the back of the small crowd since the auction opened, her coat buttoned against the October wind, her canvas tool bag at her feet. She had not come to bid. She had come because she had nothing in particular to do until 3 o'clock, when she was due at the Hartwell building to look at a set of warped floorboards that wanted pulling. The crowd was thin, a dozen men and 2 women, and most of them left after the stove lid sold. When Giles reached the door and named his opening at 50 cents, no hand went up. He said 35. Vera raised hers. No one moved. He said $2 for the lot to close it out, and she said yes. She had $17 left in the world. 2 of them had just bought a door. The men remaining in the lot laughed. Not cruelly, perhaps, but freely, the way men laugh when a woman does something they find inexplicable. One of them said she could use it for firewood before winter. Another said she could use it for nothing at all. Giles accepted her $2 with a look that mixed faint pity with relief, and Vera carried the door to the borrowed mule she had tied at the fence post and lashed it flat across the animal's back without answering anyone. She had learned long ago that answering cost more than it returned and explained less than silence did. What she could see, and they could not, was the grain. Her father, Thomas Collum, had spent 31 years as a carpenter in the river towns of southern Missouri before a fever took him in the winter of 1882. He had taught Vera everything he knew about wood, not as decoration, not as sentiment, but as a readable thing, a language that could be learned by the hand and the eye if a person was willing to be patient and willing to be wrong more than once before they were right. He had started her lessons when she was 8 years old, standing her on a low bench so she could reach the surface of his work table, pressing her palm flat against a board he had just planed, and telling her to feel whether it was with the grain or against it. She had guessed wrong for 3 weeks before she began to trust her hands over her eyes. He had shown her how to read the growth rings pressed into a plank's end grain, how to tell quarter sawn lumber from flat sawn by the angle of those rings at the cut face. He had shown her how old-growth timber, the tall trees that had come down before the market mills took over, produced a density and closeness of grain that modern milled lumber could not replicate, because modern mills had not waited long enough for anything to grow to that density. He had picked up boards in hardware stores and lumber yards and handed them to her without saying anything, and she had been expected to say what she felt. Green or dry, tight or loose, ring porous or diffuse porous, honest or graded up beyond its actual quality. He was not easy about it when she guessed wrong. He was not cruel, but he was not easy. He said the wood would not lie to her if she learned to listen. and that most of the errors carpenters made in a lifetime came from listening to themselves instead. He had taught her that wood does not lie, even when the men who shaped it do. The door she had bought was not pine. The grain was too fine, the color too deep beneath the weathered surface, the weight too honest when she had lifted it. It was old-growth Douglas fir, a species the mills around Creede had not worked in living memory. And the door was not one panel, but three, with a raised center section that Vera had recognized the instant she stood close enough to run her thumb along the edge of the joint. It was a mortise and tenon construction, hand-cut, old, the kind of work a skilled man makes when he intends for a thing to last longer than he does, when he cuts the joint with a chisel and a mallet rather than a saw because a hand-cut mortise fits more exactly and holds in the wood's own grain rather than fighting it. If you have ever held a piece of work that a skilled man made with his hands before the machines took over, you will understand what she felt standing in that salvage lot. Not sentiment. A quiet pull. The sense of something waiting to be recognized by the right person. She did not know yet what the door opened onto. She knew only that it did not belong in a salvage lot, and that someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure she would not find out why. The note had been nailed to the door itself. She found it when she unloaded the mule at the boarding house, where she rented a room by the week, a narrow room on the second floor of a building run by a woman named Hatch, who asked no questions and made no conversation, but kept clean linens and a dry stove, and that was enough. Vera leaned the door against the outer wall and ran her hands across it in the afternoon light, feeling the grain, reading the surface for damage, and her fingers found the nail before her eyes did. A square-cut nail, not a wire nail, the kind that had not been standard in hardware stores since the early years of the decade, sunk into the center panel, flush to the head with a single stroke. The note beneath it was folded twice and sized to fit under the nail head precisely. When she pried the nail with the flat of her pocket knife blade and unfolded the paper, the fold lines were stiff with age. It said, "Leave the attic sealed." Nothing more. No signature, no date, no address. The paper was the same age as the dust on the door itself, slightly foxed at the edges, the ink brown rather than black in the way of old iron gall writing. Someone had written it with a fine pointed nib and a careful hand, and had written it some years ago, and had expected the door to stay in that salvage lot. They had expected no one to buy it, or no one who could read what it was made of. They had been nearly right. Vera set the note on the table beside her water basin and held the lamp close to it and read it a third time. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket, where the carpenter's pencil already lived. She looked at the door where it stood against the wall in the long October light, amber-colored and patient. The next morning she went looking for the house it came from. Creede in 1887 was a silver town in the early years of its noise, a place where money moved fast and left little behind. The streets were unpaved and busy, the buildings going up faster than they could be finished, fortunes made and dissolved in the same season. Vera had come there 3 weeks earlier following a rumor of work, the kind of general carpentry and repair that a town in a hurry always needed. She had found enough of it to keep the boarding house room, but not enough to move forward, and the $17 remaining after the door was a number she felt precisely, the way a person always feels the weight of what is left. She asked at the hardware store first. The man behind the counter knew every piece of lumber that had passed through Creede in the past 2 years, and had no record of Douglas fir in that quantity and that quality, and he agreed with her assessment that the door had not been made locally. She asked at the freight office on the south end of Main Street. She described the door, the mortise and tenon work, the Douglas fir, the age of it, the square-cut nail that had held the note. The freight agent was a man named Cobb who had been in Creede since before the Silver Rush and who had a long memory for the movement of property in a small town. He listened to her description with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes on the middle distance. He knew. She could see that he knew before he opened his mouth. He looked at the counter for a moment, and then at her, then at the counter again. He said the door had come from a house on the upper end of Carson Street, the old D-chart property, which had been abandoned for somewhere near 11 years, and which nobody went near by custom, if not by law. He said it in the way of a man who is stating a fact and indicating simultaneously that the fact has edges he does not intend to explore. He said the property had been in dispute since Edna Deshar died in 1876. He said the heirs could not agree on the terms, and the terms could not be resolved because the records were incomplete, and the records were incomplete because some of them had gone missing. He said the attic had not been opened in 11 years. He said it in a way that told her someone had told him to say no more, or that he had decided on his own that no more was the right amount. He picked up the pen beside his ledger and held it, and did not write anything. Vera thanked him and left. The Dechard house sat at the end of Carson Street with its back to the ridge and its front to the descending grade of the street. A 2-story frame building that had been grand once by local standards. The kind of house a man builds when he wants the town to understand that he intends to be here in 10 years, and that the town should take account of that. The porch had buckled at the left corner where the support post had rotted through at the base and had been left that way. The decking boards sprung and warped. The windows on the second floor were shuttered from inside. The yard had gone to sage and dry grass and the dusty yellow of autumn rabbit brush, and the gate at the fence line hung open at an angle that told Vera the hinge pin had been worked loose a long time ago and left that way deliberately, propped on a stone rather than repaired, as if to suggest the property had already decided for itself that no one was welcome and had been making that decision for years. She stood at the gate for a full minute before she pushed it wider and walked in. The front door was unlocked. That was the first thing that surprised her. The second was the condition of the interior. Dusty and shut up, yes, and the light inside was dim and flat from the shuttered upper windows, and the air smelled of dry wood and old ash and the particular stillness of a room that has not been breathed in for a long time. The furniture was still in place. A settle and 2 chairs in the front room, upholstered in a dark green wool that had faded to gray at the sun-exposed surfaces. A sideboard in the hall with its mirror turned face in against the wall. A cast-iron stove in the kitchen with ash still in its belly, and a pothook still hanging from the crane above it. The house had not been abandoned so much as held still, sealed against intrusion and against time in equal measure, as if someone had left it this way on purpose, as if the preservation itself were a statement. She walked through the front room and into the hall and up the main stairs, her hand on the banister, testing the tread of each step before she put her weight on it. The second floor was 4 rooms, all shut, and a hall that ran to the back of the house where a narrower door stood closed. She tried each room briefly. They were empty of furniture, but not of their original fittings. The windows still had glass. The closet in the second room still had its iron hooks. The floorboards were still sound. She found the attic stairs behind the narrow door at the end of the hall. They were steep and close, barely a shoulder's width, and they climbed at a sharp angle into the dark above. The door at the top of the stairs was not locked. It had no lock, no bolt, no latch beyond a simple wooden catch that turned on a nail, the kind a man installs when he does not expect the space to need securing. What it had, she understood now, was the absence of what she had bought at the salvage lot. The frame above her was empty, the mortise holes in the jamb still holding the old chisel marks, the door itself gone from this opening and carried away, leaving the stairs accessible to anyone who climbed them. Someone had removed the door to make the attic seem already entered, to make it seem already emptied, already gone over, already finished. She was not a woman given to declarations. She sat on the second stair from the top and held her lamp and thought carefully about that. The note had been nailed to a door that should have been here. The note had said to leave the attic sealed. Someone had been very much afraid of what was in that attic, and they had tried to accomplish by removal and by long years of discouragement what they could not accomplish by lock. They wanted the conviction in the minds of any curious party that there was nothing left worth looking for. She climbed the last 2 stairs and went in. The attic was long and low, the ridge of the roof running its full length, the plank floor laid over the ceiling joists of the floor below and solid underfoot. Light came in from a single gable window at the south end. The window was shuttered, and the shutter was closed, and before the shutter was a cedar chest pushed against it with its back flush to the sash. The chest was perhaps 4 feet long and 2 feet deep, and it had been pushed to that position with some effort. Vera could see the drag marks in the dust of the floor, 4 parallel lines running from the north wall to the south, where the chest sat blocking the light. Someone had pushed that chest across the attic in the dark, or near dark, and positioned it against the window specifically to deny light to anyone who came up the stairs. And then they had removed the door from the frame below to suggest the attic had already been searched. She moved the chest 3 feet to the right and let the morning come in. The papers were stacked along the south wall where the chest had stood in front of them. Dozens of sheets, bundled and tied with string, the string gone brown with age. The topmost bundle's paper carrying the same foxed edges as the note in her coat pocket. She knelt on the floor and looked at them without touching them for a moment. Then she picked up the first bundle. The papers were deed records, land surveys, a correspondence between Randall Dechard, who had been Edna's husband, and a man named Prosper Cole, who had served as county land agent for Mineral County from 1871 until his appointment ended in 1879. The letters between them were long and careful and damning in the way that only careful letters can be. Not reckless, not hot, not the letters of men who thought they might be wrong. They were the letters of men who knew exactly what they were doing and had calculated correctly for 13 years that no one would find them. Randall Dechard had been dead for 19 years. Prosper Cole had died in 1884. Their correspondence, however, had survived. Vera sat on the floor of that attic for 3 hours and read every page in order. She read slowly because the handwriting was dense in places and the language of the letters moved in and out of the formal register that official correspondence required, and because she wanted to be certain she understood what she was reading before she drew any conclusion from it. Her father had taught her that patience was the first quality of any diagnosis, that you read the grain twice before you cut, and that cutting before you read always cost more than reading twice before you cut. She read each letter twice. When she was done, she sat for a while longer without moving, the lamp burning low beside her, the cedar chest casting its long shadow back across the floor toward the attic stairs, the morning light coming in clean and flat through the gable window. Here is what those letters said. In 1872, a man named Calvin Ferris had filed a land claim on 420 acres in the valley east of what would become Creed. He had built a house on the northern portion of it. He had worked the land for 2 years, running cattle in the summer months and wintering in the house he had built with lumber. He hauled himself from a mill in Alamosa. He had done everything the law required of a man who meant to hold a piece of ground. The filing, the improvement, the residency, the patience of waiting for the period of proof to run out so he could hold what he had earned. In 1874, a survey error had been submitted to the county land office. It was a formal document stamped and signed, asserting that Ferris had miscalculated his claim boundaries and that a significant portion of his northern acreage, 180 acres of the most viable grazing land, overlapped with land already held by a prior claimant, one Randall Dechard. The survey had been signed by Prosper Cole in his official capacity as county land agent. It had the proper forms. It had the proper stamps. It looked, to anyone who did not know what the letters in that cedar chest contained, like an honest survey error. The survey was false. The letters between Dechard and Cole made that plain without ambiguity. Cole had drawn it to specification. He had used a set of reference coordinates that did not exist in the original survey records, which he had access to and which, as the subsequent land office records showed, had been quietly altered in at least one other instance during his tenure. Dechard had paid him in 3 installments, the first at the start of their arrangement in the summer of 1873, the second when the draft survey was completed, and the third in the autumn of 1874, 2 weeks before Calvin Ferris received notice of the boundary dispute from the land office and, faced with a legal proceeding he had no money to contest and no standing to win given the document in front of him, surrendered his claim. Calvin Ferris had walked away from 420 acres of his own land. He had walked away because a false survey said he had to, drawn by a man who had been paid to say so, by a man who had wanted the land and had found it easier to steal it than to buy it. The Dechard estate had held that land, or the contested portion of it, since. The heirs were fighting over it in 1887, 3 of them, none of whom Vera had any reason to believe knew the origin of what they were arguing about. And Calvin Ferris's daughter, a woman named Josie Ferris, was still living in Creede, working at the laundry on Main Street, 43 years old, and the only surviving member of a family that had been quietly ruined before she was old enough to understand what had been taken from them. Vera did not rush. She tied the documents back into their bundles. She numbered the bundles 1 through 7 with the carpenter's pencil she carried in her coat pocket, pressing the numbers into the top sheet of each bundle lightly so the pencil marks could be erased if needed. She wrapped them in the piece of oilcloth she had found folded at the bottom of the cedar chest, beneath a layer of old newspaper from 1876, and she understood when she found it there that someone had placed it deliberately. Oilcloth to protect against damp, folded below the newspapers so that anyone who opened the chest carelessly and found only old paper might close it again without looking further. On the inside of the cedar chest's lid, written in pencil in a woman's careful hand, were 4 words and a name: Edna Dechard, 1876, and below it a single sentence written at an angle as though added after the rest, the pencil marks pressed harder than the name above. I couldn't make him put it right, but I couldn't burn it either. Vera read that sentence twice. She ran her thumb along the pencil marks, feeling the pressure of them in the wood beneath the paint. Then she closed the lid. She carried the oilcloth bundle down the narrow stairs and out of the house. If you have ever held the weight of a thing that should not have been buried as long as it was, you will know what she carried in her arms on that walk back through the gate and down Carson Street in the October noon. It was not heavy in the way of iron or stone. It was heavy in the way of time, the way a wrong accumulates weight the longer it is left undisturbed, until the weight of it is almost indistinguishable from the weight of the world as it is. She went first to the county land office, which occupied a single room in the frame building beside the assay office on Main Street. The clerk on duty was a young man named Webb, who had been in the position for 6 months and who had not been in Mineral County in 1874 and had no particular allegiance to the arrangements of the dead. He was behind the counter when she came in, entering figures into a ledger, and he looked up with the expression of a man who has not yet learned to read trouble in a face. Vera set the oilcloth bundle on the counter and unwrapped it without preamble, and explained plainly and without embellishment what she had found and where she had found it and what she understood it to mean. She told him about the attic. She told him about the cedar chest and the oilcloth and the note inside the lid in Edna Dechard's hand. She set the original note on the counter, the small square of paper with the 5 words on it, the square-cut nail still bent through its fold. Webb read the top letter. His expression did not change, which was its own kind of change. He read the second. He put it down and picked it up again, and read the part he had already read. He went to the door of the inner office and said something in a low voice to whoever was on the other side, and came back. He read the third letter. Then he looked at Vera across the counter with the expression of a man who has just understood that his morning has changed irrevocably, and that there is no version of the rest of the day in which this document goes back into the bundle, and the bundle goes back under somebody's arm. He asked her where she had obtained the documents. She told him. She told him the Dechard house, the upper end of Carson Street, the attic, the cedar chest, the window, the blocked light, the dragged chest marks in the dust, all of it. She told him she had found the house unlocked and had entered it, and she named the date and the time. He asked if she had anything else from the attic. She told him she had left everything in place, that the attic was as she had found it, that the cedar chest was still there, and that she could take him there at any hour he chose. She told him she had retained in her coat pocket the original note. She put it on the counter. Webb looked at the note for a long time without touching it. He said quietly that this was going to take some time to sort through properly. He said he would need to contact the Territorial Land Office in Denver. He said there were procedures for documents of this nature, procedures that required multiple signatories and a formal review period, and the involvement of the territory's surveyor's office. Vera said she understood procedures. She asked him to make a record, right now, of the date and the time and her name, and to note in that record that she had produced these documents from the Dechard property at this date and time, and placed them in the land office's custody. She asked him to sign the record and to give her a copy of his signature. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the ledger and made the record, and signed it, and made a copy, and gave it to her. She folded it into her coat pocket with the copy pages she'd already made in the attic with the carpenter's pencil. She left the originals in his custody and walked out into the October noon. That was how it was done. Not with a speech, not with a confrontation, with a pencil, a record, and a county clerk who had the decency to sign his name to what he had received. Josie Ferris was in the laundry when Vera found her at noon. The laundry was loud with steam, and the slap of wet linen against the wooden agitators and the low voices of the 4 women who worked the long tubs. And the air was thick and warm in the way of laundry air, smelling of lye and hot water, and the particular mineral flatness that came from the creek water. The laundry drew from the ditch on the east side of the building. Josie Ferris was at the second tub, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair pinned up and damp at the temples from the steam, and she had the lean, capable look of a woman who has worked with her hands for 20 years and whose body has organized itself around that work. She looked up when Vera came in, looked at her the way a working woman looks at a stranger who has come into a working space, which is to say she noted that Vera was not a customer and not a new hire, and drew no particular conclusion beyond that. Vera asked if they could speak outside for a moment. Josie set down the paddle she had been using and dried her hands on her apron and came. She did not ask why. She came with the manner of a woman who has learned that the world occasionally produces requests from strangers, and that the quickest way through them is to hear them out. They stood on the boardwalk outside the laundry door, which put them in the full October sun and out of the noise of the tubs. Vera told her what she had found. She told her plainly, in the order it had happened, without softening the parts that were ugly and without inflating the parts that were significant. She told her about the door in the salvage lot and the note and the house on Carson Street. She told her about the attic and the cedar chest and the oilcloth bundle and the 7 bundles of papers stacked along the south wall. She told her about the letters between Randall Dechard and Prosper Cole, and what those letters said, and what the records in the land office's own ledger showed about a claim filed in 1872 and surrendered in 1874 by a man named Calvin Ferris. She told her about Edna Dechard's sentence inside the chest lid. Josie Ferris stood on the boardwalk and listened to all of it without speaking, without moving except to keep her weight balanced on both feet, her hands loose at her sides. The steam from the laundry door drifted past them and thinned in the open air. When Vera finished, the silence lasted long enough that a wagon passed on the street behind them, and the driver said something to his horse, and the horse's hooves made their slow, deliberate sound on the ground. Then Josie said, her voice level and without tremor, "My father worked that land for 2 years. He said it once, when I was about 12, and then he never said it again. He said the survey was wrong and he could not prove otherwise, and that some things a man cannot fight with what he has." Vera said it plainly. Someone kept the proof. Josie looked at her for a moment. Her expression did not collapse into relief or gratitude. It did something more particular and harder to name. The expression of a person who has believed for most of her life that a door was closed, and who is being told now that it was never closed but only pulled to and held that way from the other side. She looked away, down the length of Main Street at the noise and motion of a silver town in its first noise. She said it without inflection. "What happens now?" Vera told her. "The land office would investigate. The territorial surveyor's office in Denver would need to be involved, given the nature of a falsified survey by a county official. It was likely," she said, "not certain but likely, that the 1874 survey would be invalidated and that Calvin Ferris's original claim would be restored to the Ferris estate on the record, at which point the land currently in dispute among the Dechard heirs would be subject to a restitution proceeding." She was not a lawyer. She could not predict the outcome. What she could say was that the proof existed and was now in lawful custody, and that it was specific and documented and signed by the men who had done it, which was the kind of proof that did not depend on anyone's word against anyone else's. Josie absorbed this in the way of someone who has lived a long time without expecting much from the direction of the past. She asked Vera one question. Why had she bought the door? Vera told her. "Because I could see what it was made of, and because the grain told me it did not belong where it was." Josie looked at her for a moment, and something in her face shifted. Not gratitude exactly, not yet, but the first small movement of a door that has been closed a very long time, beginning to consider its frame. The weeks that followed were procedural and slow, the kind of slowness that the law requires and that a person either makes peace with or does not. Webb at the land office wrote to the territorial surveyor's office in Denver and received a response after 9 days asking for the documents to be held pending the arrival of a deputy surveyor. The deputy surveyor came from Denver on the stage and spent 3 days in Creede, 2 of them in the land office and 1 of them in the attic of the Dechard house, going through the remaining papers that Vera had left in place. He was a methodical man in his 50s named Garrett, who wore good boots and spoke very little, and who, when he emerged from the attic on the afternoon of the 3rd day, told Webb that the survey in question contained reference coordinates that did not appear in any prior record and that this was, in his professional assessment, indicative of fabrication. The Deschard heirs, 4 of them, were formally notified by the territorial office in December. One of them, a nephew named Foster Deschard, who lived in Pueblo and who had been managing the disputed land through a hired agent, hired a lawyer within a week of the notification and contested the findings by return letter. The lawyer came to Creede in January of 1888, a cold and particular January, and spent 2 days reviewing the documents in the land office and another day reviewing the surveyor's supplementary report. He was a thorough man and a careful one, and Vera heard later from Webb that when the lawyer had read the full correspondence between Randall Deschard and Prosper Cole from beginning to end, he had sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the table before him and then had recommended to Foster Deschard, in clear terms, that the contest was unwinnable. He was correct. The Territorial Land Office's ruling arrived in Creede on the 14th of February, 1888. It invalidated the 1874 survey on the grounds of documented fraud perpetrated by the county land agent Prosper Cole in exchange for payment from Randall Deschard, and reinstated Calvin Ferris's original claim on the record as the valid prior claim to the disputed acreage. The ruling further noted that the Deschard estate's title to that portion of the land was voided pending restitution proceedings. The acreage could not simply be returned as it had been, for it had changed hands through the estate twice in the intervening years, and the complete unwinding of those transfers would occupy another proceeding for another season. What could be done immediately was entered into the record. Josie Ferris's name was registered as the surviving heir of record to the original Ferris claim, and the disputed portion of the Deschard estate was placed under legal hold. Vera was at the Deschard house when the ruling came. She heard about it from Webb, who found her on the porch in the February cold, with a hammer in her hand and her breath coming out in long white plumes, and who told her in a voice that carried the satisfaction of a man who has been part of something that went the right way. She thanked him. She went back to the porch board she had been setting. She had spent the better part of 3 weeks repairing the house. No one had asked her to. No one had hired her for it or offered her anything in exchange. She had done it because she was a carpenter's daughter, and she could see what wanted doing and she had the tools to do it. And because a house that has been held still for 11 years accumulates a particular kind of damage that is slow and patient. The buckled porch, the broken gate hinge, the rot at the base of the window frames where water had stood and dried, and stood again through 11 autumns. The damage was not catastrophic. It was the damage of neglect, which is to say the damage of time working on a thing that no one was tending, and that was the kind of damage a carpenter's hands understood. She replaced the buckled porch boards herself, buying the lumber from the hardware store on credit at 5 cents a running foot and paying it back over a week of morning labor at the Hartwell Building's ongoing renovation. She rehung the gate with a new hinge pin she forged herself on the anvil behind the blacksmith shop, paying for the use of the fire and the tools with an afternoon's help at the forge. She reset the window frames on the second floor and replaced 2 panes of glass and reglazed the sash with glazing compound she mixed from linseed oil and whiting. She repaired the settle in the front room where the back rail had come loose from the side post, cutting a new tenon with a chisel and fitting it wet so it would tighten as it dried. And she rehung the door. She had known she would. That had perhaps been clear to her from the moment she stood in the empty frame at the top of those narrow stairs and saw the chisel marks in the jamwood where the mortises had been cut 30 years ago by a careful hand. The door and the house had been parted by someone who had wanted to change what the door meant, to change it from a threshold into a warning. Vera had bought the door for $2 without knowing any of that, guided by nothing more than the grain and the weight and the honest quality of old-growth wood in a salvage lot. She brought it back on the mule on a clear morning in mid-November and carried it up the porch steps herself. It fit the frame precisely, as she had known it would. The mortise and tenon seated with a solid click she felt through both palms when she drove the pin, the kind of click a well-made joint makes when it comes home to its own wood after a long absence. She had cleaned the surface with linseed oil and a soft cloth before rehinging it, working the oil into the grain with slow circular strokes until the Douglas fir showed its true color, a deep amber gold, the color of old honey, the color of a wood that had taken 100 years of slow growth to reach the density that made it worth preserving. The raised center panel caught the afternoon light and reflected it back warm against the porch ceiling. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment, her hands at her sides, the oilcloth folded over her arm. It was a good door. It had always been a good door. It had simply needed to be where it belonged, opened by the person for whom it had been waiting. A week after the ruling, Josie Ferris came to the house on Carson Street for the first time. Vera was on the porch replacing a board when she arrived. Josie stood at the gate and looked at the house for a while without speaking. Then she came through and walked slowly up the path, looking at the repaired porch, the rehung gate, the new glass in the upstairs windows. She stopped in front of the door. She looked at it for a long time. She put her hand flat against the center panel and held it there. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Vera set down her mallet and said she would leave her to it. She gathered her tools into the canvas bag her father had given her, the bag she had carried out of Missouri 5 years earlier, and which still bore, on the underside of the flap, the initials TC pressed into the leather with a marking iron. She shouldered the bag and went down the porch steps and through the gate and left Josie Ferris standing with her hand on the door of the house that should have always been someone's. The proceedings around the land claim continued for another 1.5 years. Vera was not present for most of them. She had moved on by spring, following work north toward Gunnison, then west toward Grand Junction, then south again toward the New Mexico territory, the way a person who works with their hands moves through the world, pulled by what needs doing and what she can do. She heard from Webb through a letter that found her in Taos in the summer of 1889 that the restitution proceeding had concluded and that Josie Ferris had received a settlement from the Dutchard estate, not the land itself, which had been sold twice over and could not be unwound, but a sum agreed upon by the estate's legal counsel as the value of what had been taken in the year of its taking, adjusted to present measure. It was not a fortune. It was not nothing. Webb wrote that Josie Ferris had used a portion of it to buy the house on Carson Street outright. He wrote that the door was still on its hinges. There is a thing Vera's father used to say when a piece of work came together the way it was meant to. The material had been waiting for the right hand to find it. He did not mean this as sentiment. He meant it as observation, the plain fact of a carpenter who had spent 31 years working with wood that had its own grain and its own nature, and would tell you, if you were patient enough to listen, exactly what it needed. A door is not a mystery. It is a threshold. It is the place where the sealed thing and the open world meet, and the difference between them is no more and no less than the will of whoever holds the key. Vera Collum had paid $2 for a door in the autumn of 1887. She had not known, when she bid, what was on the other side of it. She had known only that the grain was honest and the work was old, and that both of those things deserved better than a salvage lot. She was right about that. She was usually right about the things the grain told her. The bag with the initials TC on the flap made the journey with her to Taos, and then to Silver City, and then to a town in the Arizona Territory, whose name is not important to this account. It was worn through at the left shoulder strap by the time she had it resoled at a saddle shop in 1893. She had it repaired rather than replaced. The leather was still good. The marking iron's impression had held through years of weather and work. She kept it until the straps gave out entirely, and then she had the leather cut down and made into a smaller pouch, which she carried in her coat pocket where the carpenter's pencil had always lived. TC was still on the flap. She liked that. Some things are worth the trouble of keeping, even when the form they take changes. That is not sentiment. That is the plain observation of a woman who learned from a good carpenter how to read what lasts. If you have known someone who taught you to see what others overlook, leave a word about them below. That kind of teaching does not expire. And if you want another story from these territories, there is one waiting just past the end of this one, about a woman who paid even less for something the world had decided was finished. Stay with it. The grain will tell you.